Uh, I'm very grateful to those who invited me to lecture on this particular topic. I'm grateful to the organisers of the City of London Festival, and also indeed to the staff of this college who have done much to make my preparation of this lecture helpful and pleasant. I have to tell you that my wife and I employ a very nice gardener, a lady who does the heavy lifting, which I can't anymore do. And she asked me what I was doing, toiling in my study. And I said, well, I'm trying to prepare a lecture about treaties. And she said, treaties, those are the agreements that states make and then break. And I thought, that's quite a profound insight. And I said, well, yes, that is true on many occasions, but really I'm going to try to be more concerned with why states observe treaties and how treaties supported by diplomacy, which in effect makes them, provide a kind of cement or glue to bind the international society of states together. And I'll say more about that in due course. Now, it's appropriate that we have this topic for discussion this year because, in effect, we are celebrating the 300th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht. And in effect, the occasion provides me with the opportunity to reflect on treaties in general, their role as a source of international law, and their contribution to the maintenance of order and stability in international relations. Bear in mind that the international system has often been described as an anarchy because there's no central global authority with the necessary regulatory power and legitimacy to provide an appropriate means of global governance. And this topic, treaties, diplomacy, how despite that anarchic context, that anarchic structure of international politics, nonetheless, there is a sense in which states do combine, do collaborate, do work together, and treaties and diplomacy, in effect, play a very important role in that particular situation. Now, this is a huge topic, ladies and gentlemen. I can't do justice to it in the space of 50 minutes or so. I can skim the surface. Legions of lawyers and IR, international relations specialists, have devoted their lives to thinking, writing, talking, arguing, making treaties, and all I can do is offer you a rather perhaps simplistic view of their significance and importance. But let me start, at least, because it is 2013, let me start by assessing the significance of the Utrecht Treaty signed in 1713. This was a treaty, as I'm sure all you know, ended the long drawn-out conflict of the War of the Spanish Succession. I do not propose to tell you the detailed story of that war. It's defied better men and women than I to make sense of that conflict. The best account, I think, for those of you who are really interested but don't want to read the texts of historians, the best account is a recent article in History Today by Professor Jeremy Black of the University of Durham. He's a leading authority in this period, and in the space of 4 or 5 pages, he explains how the treaty, in effect, rearranged the map of Europe. So I do commend that to you. I think it came out in June of this year. It's a monthly magazine, as no doubt many of you know. Now, the point about Utrecht was that it drew heavily on earlier precedents, notably the Great Treaty of Westphalia, signed in 1648. That ended yet another long drawn-out conflict, the 30 Years' War. And what Westphalia did was, in effect, to promote the establishment, and I'm quoting from an authority on the subject, was to promote the establishment of an international order based on sovereign states, sovereign secular states, interacting as equals, regardless of their internal form of government, their degree of resource possession, or their military potential. The Congress, the Westphalia Congress, established a new way, if you like, to resolve international problems, to resolve them through negotiation among all equal interested parties. As one distinguished historian has remarked, the Westphalia Congress was the first truly secular international gathering. Its characteristic features involved the coming together of representatives of sovereign states, all coming together to negotiate a treaty to settle a long drawn-out war. Therefore, Westphalia set precedents for similar gatherings, such as those which led subsequently to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and a host of similar congresses which in fact litter international history. Thus, taken together, Westphalia and Utrecht established a pattern of state interaction which has endured. It's been flexible enough to provide a set of refinements from one period to another, from one age to another, as global circumstances have changed. That's the great thing about some treaties, about some constitutions. You could argue, I suppose, that these treaties, Westphalia, Utrecht, were in a curious kind of way constitutions of the emerging international society of states. And the great thing about a constitution is that it should be short and simple and straightforward and easy to understand. That is the great virtue, after all, of the American Constitution, which has lasted as long as it has done. And both Utrecht and Westphalia have made a contribution to international politics which has persisted. And that, I think, is one of the great virtues, one of the great benefits of those two treaties, and they should be taken together. Now, historians are rightly cautious of believing that, the new society of sovereign secular states emerged in one fell swoop from both the Westphalian Treaty and the Utrecht Treaty. It didn't. You can find indications of that treaty emerging before Utrecht, before Westphalia, and of course that process was improved and made more refined over the years. What both those treaties taken together did do, was to lead to the erosion of the medieval principle of hierarchy. In other words, the role of the church, the role of the papacy as a major actor in international relations began to lose its significance. And this was a process which began in 1648 but continued for a long time thereafter. Thus, it's fair to say that Utrecht, based as it was on Westphalian foundations, set the pattern, set precedents for the great treaties that followed suit. What is especially interesting about Utrecht, in terms of its long-term significance, is that it was the first treaty, and I quote, that specifically mentioned a balance of power as a device for obtaining general peace and securing the tranquility of Europe. Now, the balance of power is not a new device, is not a new structure, is not a new institution. It didn't magically appear in the early years of the 18th century. You can go back to the Peloponnesian Wars. The Greek city-states enjoyed or tried to use a balance of power as a way of organizing international relations. So there was nothing new about the balance of power, but what you get is its enshrinement in a treaty which has legal force. And that is really why Utrecht, I think, is very important. And I shall say more about that balance of power in due course. It was a regulatory institution which played a critical role in subsequent centuries. But before I get on to the balance of power, before I get on to diplomacy, before I get on to treaties in general, I must, I think, try and set the whole discussion about treaties in some kind of theoretical context. I want to offer some thoughts on international theory as a background to this discussion of the role of treaties and the role of diplomacy in establishing them. Now, like all social sciences, physical sciences for that matter, the study of international relations and indeed its practice, the practice of international relations by politicians, has been dominated by a debate about the relevance, the utility, and the morality of certain kinds of theory of international relations. The dominant paradigm, the theory that has dominated thinking and practice of international relations for decades, for centuries, is realism, as it's called. William James, the great American psychologist, once said that what you have to do as a social scientist is try and grasp the nature of the booming, buzzing confusion of the world, international or domestic. And that's a pretty good description, I think, of the world, the booming, buzzing confusion. And what academics do, understandably, and I think rightly, is to try and impose some order, some pattern on that booming, buzzing confusion. And the consequence is that academics, being academics, are disputatious. They're always arguing, talking, writing, disagreeing with each other, quite rightly. They have developed particular theoretical perspectives on the nature, structure, process of international politics. And the two great theories that contend for dominance, for paradigmatic status, as it were, in the field are realism on the one hand and liberalism on the other. And I use the term liberalism in a very wide sense because it covers a multitude of theories and some would say a multitude of sins. Realism, by contrast, stresses that in the absence of a dominant world government structure, states live in an anarchical society where self-help is the only strategy for ensuring security. Hence the importance given by realists to the principle of sovereignty, which was recognized by Westphalia and emphasized, reinforced by Utrecht, the principle of sovereignty and its associated principle, non-intervention. The assumption was, if you want order in international society, and it's only going to be precarious at best, but if you want order, then you better recognize that every state has a right to its own sovereign jurisdiction over its territory and over its people. And if you want to preserve that international society of sovereign states with sovereignty as the great protection accorded to all states, then all states must subscribe to the principle of non-intervention, because that means that you will then at least have a precarious order. The realist admits that if you go down that road, sovereignty is absolute, non-intervention is the only respectable principle for governing relations between states and preventing war. Okay, order is provided, however precarious, for a period of time until it breaks down. But of course that order takes effect at the expense of justice. That order takes effect at the expense of justice. But the realist would say, better order than injustice or justice being sought by those who would disturb that order. Cold War is a good example of the primacy given by realists and by politicians to order, the maintenance of order, as distinct from the provision of justice to subject peoples. There was a kind of, as you know, a kind of implicit understanding between the superpowers and their allies at the end of the Second World War that each would have a sphere of interest. And that sphere of interest, in that sphere of interest, each superpower would be sovereign and the other superpower would refrain from intervention. Well, fine, but it meant that for Czechs and Poles, Bulgarians, Hungarians, justice was a long time coming, and it only came when the Cold War ended and the Soviet system collapsed. So you get order, certainly, and that's what realists pride themselves on providing, taking steps, making policies which provide order, however precarious, even if that means you have to sacrifice justice to those who are suffering abuse of their human rights. And if you look at the language of realists, they will stress the importance of the national interest, The national interest is always paramount. That must dictate what your policy should be. If you're going to defend and assert a national interest, well, you better have as much power at your disposal as you can organize. Power measured in economic, political, and military terms. These days, there's much talk about soft power, but power it is nonetheless. Soft power means offering states, other states, something that they would find attractive, but it's still power of a sort. So power for the realist matters profoundly. And realists would argue that states in these circumstances, living in this anarchic society, have no alternative but to defend and enhance that national interest, which they alone can and will define, because there's no one else around, no world government to define that interest for them. The best summary in one pithy sentence of realism and its basic premise is that by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian Wars, where he says, "The strong do what they can, the weak do what they must." Not a bad description of the realist position. The strong do what they can. They've got the resources. They make sure they've got as much resources they need so they can do what they wish to do. The weak don't have those resources. They must do whatever the strong dictate. Now, this reading of international relations between states takes the view that relations between states, treaties between states, such as they are, have only limited short-term value. A state may enter a treaty because it needs the support of an ally against a third party who is threatening both. But that alliance will be dissolved as soon as that problem has been solved. Now, one way of distinguishing between realism on the one hand and its counterpart, liberalism, is to consider the terminology which both employ in decisions on international relations. Realists talk about order, power, the national interest. Liberals, or internationalists by contrast, they discourse on peace and how best to obtain it. They put their faith in collective security structures, like the old League of Nations or indeed the modern United Nations. They put their faith in the coordination of strategies to find peace through cooperation via international or regional institutions. Realists and liberals are at odds with each other. The realists are Westphalians, fiercely attached to the principle of sovereignty, skeptical about interventionism, and defending the claim throughout that the state is the key actor in international relations. Liberals, by contrast, are skeptical about the notion of absolute sovereignty. They regard it as an outdated doctrine to be brushed aside when gross dereliction of human rights occurs. Interestingly, I think the point I want to emphasize here is that on the face of it, realism and liberalism seem to be two quite separate dimensions of thought and practice. You know, never the twain shall meet. But in fact, they intersect all the time. My own view, my own theoretical position is that realists and liberals have more in common than they imagine, that there is and can be moral content to the definition and implementation of a particular country's national interest, that there can be moral overtones, moral assumptions underpinning both the definition of a national interest and how it should be implemented. Best example I can give you in contemporary terms is Tony Blair, when he made that famous speech extolling the doctrine of the international community to a group of Chicago academics and publicists on the 50th anniversary of NATO's foundation in the middle of the Kosovo crisis. He declared himself, in effect, to be a liberal. In effect, he said, when there's real abuse of human rights, when there's evidence of genocide, then sovereignty must and can and should be brushed aside. And the globe, the world community of states, call it what you like, can intervene to redress the the derelictions of human rights that are occurring. Of course, he said you had to have the political will to do it, you had to have the resources to do it, the strategic context had to be right, you had to have the prospect of success using your resources to put right those human abuses, those human rights abuses, and right at the end, almost as an afterthought, having defined the liberal doctrine of intervention, given the horrors of the wars in Yugoslavia, the wars in Rwanda. This was the context in which this doctrine was pronounced, this doctrine of the international community. But right at the end, almost as an afterthought, and he said, and of course, the national interest must be engaged if we are to intervene in this way. So there you get, it seems to me, an intersection of liberalism on the one hand and realism on the other. So there are other examples one can come to, and what I'm really trying to argue is that the notion that realism and liberalism are in two separate dimensions is, I think, a mistake. There are bloody-minded realists, I grant you, I mean, who would brush aside any concern with morality and who would simply emphasize the means of accumulating power and using that power to defend your national interest. But by and large, even the most hard-hearted, cold-blooded realist does, I think, very often have a moral case to underpin his or her realism. So much for the, if you like, the hard-nosed version of realism. But there is a softer version, which is sometimes called enlightened realism or sophisticated realism, which allows for intersection between realism and idealism, which allows for liberal aspiration, and indeed allows for the possibility of seemingly liberal progress on particular issues. Now, this view, this softer version of realism, was in effect devised and noised abroad by the so-called English School of International Relations. And I myself am a product of that particular school. Let me declare my hand straight away. It was generated across the road or down the road at the London School of Economics in the 1950s and 60s. And academics there combined with their counterparts at Cambridge and people in the Foreign Office to see whether they could get away from the terrifyingly seductive impact that realism made on young people's minds. Realism was enormously seductive because it seemed to explain anything and everything. It was all national interest, nothing you could do. Morality only came into it by default. And most of us as undergraduates at that time were constantly trying to find a way around this. Is there a better way of looking at realism than simply accepting the Hobbesian view of realism? Thomas Hobbes, who described the state of nature as poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Old-fashioned realists said that's the nature of international relations, nasty, brutish, and short, unless you protect yourself by some leviathan or other. And we as young men and women were trying to break away from that view of realism, trying to see whether there was a softer version. And one of the great exponents of that English theory, that English school version, was not English, but he was an Australian, a remarkable academic, a close friend, mentor, colleague of mine, a man called Hedley Bull, taught at both the LSE and at Oxford and in Canberra in Australia. Died tragically young, aged 54, an extraordinary man. Wrote a book which was published in 1974, which is still, in a way, one of the founding texts of the English School of International Relations. It's called The Anarchical Society, The Anarchical Society, The Search for Order in International Relations. That was the full title of the book. And he took the view that you could look at international relations and perceive a society rather than a system of states. And that society, he argued, was conscious, the states that made up that society, was conscious of certain interests, common interests, and certain common values. What was the common interest binding all those states together? The common interest was survival States are conservative creatures, by and large. They want to survive. They want their territory to survive. They want their people to survive, by and large. And that was a common interest which bound all states together in that society of states. And there were common values, Bull argued, which bound states together. One was that if you make a promise, if you sign a treaty, which is part of international law as a consequence, then you must keep your promise. You must keep the promise that you made by signing that treaty. Pacta sunt servanda. Treaties are made to be kept. That's a value which pretty well all states do share, although they do from time to time, as my gardener pointed out, break that rule. Another common value, if you like, in uniting states in Bull's version of international society is that war may come and you may have to accept that wars are going to be fought because you want to defend yourself against an aggressor, and there are plenty of those around from time to time. But war should only be considered, this is what he argued to be a common value, as a last resort, when every other possibility of finding a solution to a particular problem has been solved. And indeed, that principle of war as a last resort is embedded in the UN. If you look at the Security Council, the clauses dealing with the Security Council, Chapter 6 deals with all those techniques of finding a way around a problem, mediation, going to the International Court, arbitration, good officers, diplomacy. But if that fails, if you tried all those things, none of them have worked, then it is arguable war is a last resort, can be employed. But if you try war, if you fight war, then it must be fought in terms of reasonable principles. There must be the principle of proportionality applying in the way that war is fought. So Bull argued that all these states in international society were conscious of certain interests, certain common values. He went on to say they form a society in the sense that they conceive themselves to be bound by a common set of rules in their relations with one another. And the common set of rules is basically what international law is, a common set of rules in their relations with one another. And then, his last phrase, they share in the work, all the states in this international society share in the work of what he calls common institutions. And this is where it gets interesting, because what are these common institutions that unite states together in a society? Well, first of all, the balance of power. The balance of power is a structure, a process which has operated for decades, for centuries, and states manipulate it in the hope of becoming dominant in the balance of power. Other states take counteraction against that dominance, but it does mean that you get a kind of flexibility in international relations, and with luck, you get a kind of order emerging. Secondly, another institution, international law, which is the key structure for treaty making, because every treaty made of any substance or significance is seen as part of international law, becomes part of international law. Then diplomacy, another institution. Diplomacy is an institution designed where it can to find an overlapping interest which will unite states and allow them to find solutions to difficult problems. Also, the other two institutions which he points to seem rather odd, but I think there's justice behind his thinking here. One is what he called the managerial system of the great powers, the managerial system of the great powers. This is extremely interesting because what it does demonstrate, against all the odds, is that politicians, and by definition their states, can learn from past experience. They don't always. They very often ignore the lessons of past experience and think they've found a new solution which has nothing to do with the past but everything to do with the present and the future. But there are examples in international relations of states and governments, negotiators, treaty makers, learning from past experience. And the best example I can give you is the Security Council of the UN, which combines realism and liberalism in a most interesting and productive way. Not always, but it can work and does work from time to time. It's not perfect, but it's the best you can do in the circumstances. Because if you think about it, those who drew up the Charter of the UN were acutely conscious of the mistakes their forebears had made when the League of Nations was devised. The League of Nations was based on the assumption that war was the worst thing that could happen to international society, to any state, whether victor or vanquished. The outcome would be terrifying. That was the assumption that the founders of the League of Nations took. They believed that that was the worst thing that could happen. Therefore, the argument was, it was a fallacious argument, but you can understand, a good liberal argument in a way. Every state had an equal and compelling interest to deter war from happening and to take action when it did happen. If state A threatened state B, then state C to Z would come to the aid of state B. That was the so-called famous liberal doctrine of collective security. And what's extraordinary about the Treaty of Versailles, which settles the First World War, is that it combines the most punitive punishment of Germany for, as they saw it, starting the war, huge reparations, no attempt to reconstruct Germany in a really sensible, meaningful way. And the consequence is the Great Depression, the rise of Hitler, and all the rest of it. So that's realism carried to its terrifying conclusion. On the other hand, Wilson and co., the great liberals, Lloyd George, devised the League of Nations as the kind of liberal answer to the prevention of war in the future. But it was assumed that every state had an interest in stopping, preventing, deterring war whenever and wherever it occurred. So if Bolivia attacked Peru, Greece and Egypt would be equally compelled to go to the aid of Peru. It doesn't work like that. Greece might say, we have no interest in what Peruvians and Bolivians do to each other. Not our interest, not our war, it's not our fight. So when the UN was set up, 44, 45, those who drew up the Charter, many of them had been involved in the making of the covenants of the League, Keynes, Smuts, a host of others. They said, well, we can't go back to the League of Nations structure where every state is equally involved in trying to prevent and deter war and deal with it when it does occur. Let us be realists and acknowledge that the great powers can manage international relations. Only they have the resources, the commitment and the will to stop war breaking out and deter it before it does break out. Only they can do that. And therefore, let's give the great powers the primary sole responsibility for managing the work of the new United Nations. And that role, as you know, is written into the Charter in Chapter 7. So there was a degree of learning there, wasn't there? They recognized that with power, the great powers had it in abundance, especially the United States and the Soviets. With power went responsibility. Now, as soon as you start talking about responsibility, you're entering a liberal dimension of thought and practice, aren't you? If I say I'm responsible for X or Y, I'm, in a sense, making some kind of moral statement about my behavior and my commitment and my feeling that I ought to see what I can do to be helpful to A or B, if that's for whom I am responsible. So once you build into a charter like the UN the notion of power, yes, power being important, that's a good realist assumption. But once you tie it to responsibility, then realism and liberalism seem to interact. So that was, if you like, an example of liberalism and realism coming together. Now, Bull's theory that those institutions, international law, diplomacy, managing system of the great powers, even war, he said, is an institution. What did he mean by that? You don't think of war as an institution. Well, a good old-fashioned realist would say, of course it's an institution. What great cataclysmic wars do is destroy an old, outmoded, unsatisfactory order, and on the ruins of that destroyed order, which is war, a new order emerges like a phoenix from the ashes. And for the true cold-blooded realist, international relations is simply one damn war after another, interspersed with periods of precarious order. But how do you break the cycle? How do you break the cycle? How do you get away from a picture of international relations, which is Hobbesian? You know, one damn war after another with a bit of peace in between. Order, disorder, and so it goes. And you could read international history in just those terms. It gives you an explanation of sorts of the pattern of international history. And yet, it doesn't always follow. It doesn't always follow. Much turns, does it not? Here we come back to treaties. Much turns on how you treat your defeated enemy. If you see your defeated enemy as deserving punishment for having the folly, the nerve to start a war, then you will treat that defeated enemy badly. You pay no attention to his claims for some kind of fairness or justice, even though he is defeated. You know, you will treat him badly. But there are examples of politicians, statesmen, in the way they fight wars and in the way they make treaties ending those wars, recognizing, not always, but from time to time they're good examples, recognizing that you have to pay some attention to the needs, the aspirations, the feelings, the sensitivities of the defeated enemy. We didn't do that in 1919. We did that in 1945, no question. We did that in 1945, despite, or perhaps because of the Holocaust, you know, because of the terrifying vision of the Holocaust and what that meant. Nonetheless, the victorious Allies looked at the defeated powers, Italy, Germany, Japan, and said, we can't repeat the mistakes of 1919 and just treat them as dirt, as people deserving ultimate, infinite punishment. In fact, you know, every effort was made to restore Italy, Germany, and Japan to sovereign status, to a degree of democratic government, very acceptable and very, very well organized, and also to a degree of sound, healthy economic development. I mean, I think one of the great miracles of international relations in the post-war period, post-1945 period, is that you fight this war against people who really are pretty nasty, not the whole of German or Italian or Japanese society, but the leadership, the elites who fought that war and who did dreadful things to people, including the Holocaust. Despite that, you defeat them, and then you make quite sure that somehow they have their sovereignty, some decent government, some prospect of economic growth restored. And look, think about it, people. 1945, think of the state of Germany, blown to bits, devastated. Japan, 2 cities obliterated. Italy suffered, not as much perhaps, but a good deal nonetheless. 10 years later, 1955, you have 3 functioning democracies enjoying pretty high standard of living, providing security and welfare for their people. I mean, that's a victory for liberalism in international relations, it seems to me. It's a victory for liberalism. What did we do in this country? We brought to Wilton Park, the Foreign Office Conference Centre, we brought, it's a horrible phrase and I don't like using it, but it was one that was used at the time, we brought who we assumed were good Germans. And there were plenty of them. Think of Konrad Adenauer, mayor of Cologne, throughout the war, keeps his head down, somehow manages to keep the city running, but never joins the Nazi party, has no sympathy for the Nazis. He's, if you like, in those terms, a good German. We bring them to Wilton Park, and we, again, rather patronizingly, I suppose, in retrospect, educate them in the ways of good democratic government. But of course, there was something to build on. What Nazism, what fascism did was to fracture a state and a society and a system which in the past had elements of democratic government and good economic governance. So that getting it back to where it was, while it was difficult and not easy, nonetheless it could be done for a variety of reasons. Now that all seems to me to be an example of liberalism at its best. Now, you could argue, the realist would say, oh, come on, Jack, rubbish. The reason we gave the Germans, Italians, the Japanese decent political and economic institutions was because we were worried about the Russians. We wanted to keep them at bay, so we wanted some good, reliable allies. Well, yes, that's true to a degree. That was part of the reason, I suppose, but it wasn't the entire reason. You know, men and women who make these decisions, as they did in 1945 to 1950, are not computers, you know, hammering out the best way of doing this at all, not a bit. They had moral assumptions, moral sensitivities about how you treated a defeated enemy. And therefore you get this extraordinary example, it seems to me, of realism and liberalism combining. Now, as I said earlier, the great example of the intersection of liberalism and conservatism is, I think, treaty making in a sense. Treaty making very often combines concern for power, concern for interest, concern for status, but it also combines liberal assumptions. Take the European Union. Again, a most extraordinary development, was it not? In the 1940s, Europe is devastated, and yet a bunch of clever technocrats, influenced by an academic called David Matrani, take the view that it's possible for states to combine together, to work together in an integrated whole. And this is what happened, bit by bit, step by step, treaty by treaty by treaty. The European Union, whatever you may think about it, whether you think it's gone too far or not far enough, you can debate that endlessly. I don't propose to do that now. But the European Union was the product of a succession of treaties based on the principle not of setting up immediately after the war, as some people wanted, a United States of Europe, you know, having a grand convention, a grand constitutional debate, and setting up a United States of Europe. European nationalism was far too strong for that to take effect. So what did they do? They adopted Matrani's great theory, put into practice Matrani's great theory of functional integration. You take a function of the state and you set up institutions, trans-European, transnational institutions, to regulate that function. And the first such institution was, of course, the coal and steel community of 1950. No one talks about it now, it's forgotten by most people, but it was a critically important development, because for the first time, the sinews of war, coal and steel, were put under a Europe-wide, well, not Europe-wide, but at least 6 states combined together to take on the responsibility for that function, with a bureaucracy, a court, council of ministers, the usual paraphernalia. And the assumption was that if that worked, and states did collaborate, then there'd be a spillover effect, you know, and the way would be clear for the next chunk of functional integration. And so it's gone ever since. All those treaties that litter the history of the European Union are an example of functional step-by-step integration. It's a liberal idea, it's a liberal ideal. And that's where I think it has crucial significance, so that the European Union is a liberal creation, and you know, deserves praise for that, although there might be debate about whether it's gone too far or not far enough. I mean, that's an argument we can't really have now, but it's certainly there, there's no question. So, for the states that came together in 1950 to form that European coal and steel community, what moved them? What moved them? Certainly, they wanted Europe to be strong because they were fearful of the Russians, as everybody else was at the time. That was certainly so. But what they really wanted, and what functional integration achieved, was to stop Frenchmen killing Germans and vice versa, which they had done for centuries. It was possible to be a very, very old person in 1950 And remember 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, remember the First World War, and remember the Second World War, where Frenchmen and Germans had clashed and killed, for decades. And that's what moved those technocrats. That's a moral liberal aspiration. It breaks with the realist view that nothing changes, that you simply have to accept the cycle of order, disorder, order, disorder. Perhaps, what's the time here? One last point, and there are many points I could cover, but sadly there isn't enough time for them. Treaty making and diplomacy go on all the time. Okay, there are grand treaties being made, ones that, underpin the European Union, Lisbon Treaty, and so forth and so on. Sure. But one of the consequences of globalization, one of the consequences of huge technological developments in communication, bringing people together in all sorts of ways at all sorts of levels, one of the consequences of that is that somehow states have to combine together, again this is the liberal aspiration, to make sure that relationships between their peoples can proceed on an even reasonable keel, on a reasonable basis. And the consequence is that ever since the 19th century there's been a multiplication of what are called functional organizations. Think about it. You can walk out of this college, find the nearest postbox, put a letter in the postbox, post it to Italy, it'll get there. You don't even think about it. You assume that it will, and of course it will. You can get on an aircraft at Heathrow and assume that it will get you to Rome or Berlin or wherever you want to go. You don't think about it unless you're very nervous as a fly, but most of us, get on planes, get off planes, and assume that things will go smoothly, as they, on the whole, do. But this isn't the product of magic. The fact that I can post a letter and it'll get to its destination, the fact that I can fly across the globe and get to my destination on time, in safety, is a product of very intense diplomatic negotiation, which results in the establishment of a functional treaty of an organization dedicated to making the business of posting letters and flying aircraft possible and safe. The Universal Postal Union, set up in the 19th century, was just that. The International Air Transport Association is just that. Now, those organizations, and the world, ladies and gentlemen, is littered with them, hundreds of them, all there to promote cooperation, to promote good relations between individuals in particular societies. But it does mean that you have to meet from time to refine the processes that you set in motion to make sure that they work, to take into account new technology. So I think that's one of the great virtues of treaty making and diplomacy, because all these agreements are treaties, are treaty made. And what makes the treaty? The diplomatic negotiation that takes place. I'll end, because there are other things I could say. I haven't even talked about negotiating with terrorists. My students are obsessed with that and want to know whether you can, should, must negotiate with them. And it's a good debate, it's a good argument. But I haven't, I'm afraid, time to discuss that. But it is one of the things that we have to think about, because the world is now full of new actors, one of whom is terrorists, and how do you deal with them? Let me just finish by quoting Bull, describing this business of interstate collaboration via diplomacy and treaty making. He says, without the negotiation of agreements, international relations would be possible, but they would consist only of fleeting, hostile encounters between one political community and another. Agreements are possible only if the interests of the parties, while they may be different, this is the key phrase, overlap at some point. And if the parties are able to perceive that they do overlap, he goes on to say, the art of the diplomat in treaty making is to determine what that area of overlapping interest is, and through reason and persuasion to bring the parties to an awareness of it. I mean, that's a wonderful definition of diplomacy at its very best, because it implies certain values, doesn't it? Restraint, civility, compromise, being polite, taking into account what your opponent has to say. These are the values of private life, but they can be translated into diplomatic negotiation. And he goes on to say, what diplomacy is for is for states to visualize foreign policy as the rational pursuit of interests which, at least in principle, at some point overlap with the interests of other states. And that's a pretty good example of the way realism and liberalism, it seems to me, interact. He does make one qualification, and this is my last point. He says, what makes states appear to behave rationally in this way? And the only answer I can give personally is that states are conservative. They all share a common interest in survival. They all share a common interest in the maintenance of the international society of states, of which they are constituent parts. But there are examples, there are cases, he says, where diplomacy, treaty making can have no role. He talks about those who, for one reason or another, wish to promote the true faith against heretics. They're not negotiable. Those people don't open themselves to negotiation. They're not interested in compromise. He also says you can't really get that kind of recognition of an overlapping interest in getting a treaty signed to meet everybody's interests. You can't do that if ideological division is too profound. There I take issue with him, because I think even at the height of the Cold War, when Russia and the West were at odds with each other, ideologically speaking, nonetheless, both sides negotiated arms control agreements and embodied them in treaties, and they did so because, well, realism said you must do it to strengthen deterrence. That was important, that was crucial. But you must also do it because if deterrence breaks down, we don't want, the destruction of human life on a universal scale. Again, the liberal impulse. So these two things come together from time to time in that way. I could have said more, ladies and gentlemen. My time's run out. I'm conscious that there's much more to say. The only consolation, for what it's worth, I can offer you is that I will put all this dutifully down online with footnotes, no plagiarism. It'll be absolutely, it'll be absolutely pristine in that respect. And I will incorporate in that online version some of the observations that I wasn't able to make today. But thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.